Hi guys, welcome to the Cambridge Creatives Q&A with Will Tennant. I'm Hannah Collins, co-president of Cambridge Creatives.
And I'm Fabs, also co-president. Thank you so much for supporting Cambridge Creatives. As you probably have heard before, we are a student-run creative collective. We are curating a series of talks with world-renowned professionals in film, TV and theatre, so please follow our Facebook page to find out more about future events and opportunities. Just a few housekeeping rules before we begin. If you have any questions for our guest speaker, please type them into the Q&A function just there, and we will read them out for you. Also, bear with us if there are any technical difficulties, and let us in the chat if there are any problems hearing or seeing us. And most of all, enjoy the Q&A.
So just a little introduction for our guest today. Will is a producer and head of development for Imaginarium Productions, the production company set up by Jonathan Cavendish and Andy Serkis. He was also involved in the development of the feature film Breathe, directed by Andy Serkis again, and starring Andrew Garfield and Claire Foy. He was instrumental to the development of The Ritual, directed by David Bruckner and starring Rafe Spall, serving as Imaginarium's executive producer, and most recently he served as executive producer on Taika Waititi's latest film, Next Goal Wins, starring Michael Fassbender and Elizabeth Moss. And he is currently producing the film No One Gets Out Alive for Netflix. We are incredibly honoured to have this acclaimed producer and Cambridge alumnus speak today.
I'm definitely not acclaimed. Let me just get that straight. Nor renowned, but anyway.
You are to us. So my first question for you is, when did you know that you wanted to be a producer or just work in film?
Work in film was, I think I got really into cinema when I was about 15, 16. I started staying up late and watching movies. The Channel 4 used to have great films at about 11:30. And I used to either watch them or, in fact, they had lots of films at 2 a.m. So I used to record them on VHS. And just got into cinema generally, which led to an interest in filmmaking. And so together with my friends, we used to mess around with a early digital camcorder and make silly short films. And that interest in filmmaking grew and grew. I'm going to apologize in advance because you're going to hear kids in a second because it's bedtime in our household. Led to a desire to sort of pursue a career and go to film school. And my parents very sensibly talked me out of going directly to film school and said, get a degree first, just in case it doesn't work out. And so I ended up going to Cambridge. And while there, at the end of my first year, I did a 4-week filmmaking course at the London Film Academy, which gave a sort of practical overview of all aspects of filmmaking. How to operate a 16mm camera, how to operate, basic operation of sound recording, how to make a almost professional quality short film, which in those days was harder than it is now with the sort of access to easy digital equipment that we have, which I thought was brilliant and only furthered my desire to get into filmmaking, and in fact branched out an interest into things like cinematography. So what I used to do in my holidays after that first course was get experience working on short film sets. There was I don't know if it still exists, but there was a website called Shooting People that was very good for just getting gigs. They were always unpaid or expenses only, but on a short film, I guess that's not really a problem. And rather than be the runner, I used to say I knew a bit about lights, and so I'd be what's called a spark. And just it gives you, if you're not sort of running around making other people tea and coffee, and you can actually do something useful on set, I think you get a lot more out of the experience. So I did that, and then at the end of university, I enrolled on the 1-year filmmaking diploma at the London Film Academy, which I loved. Again, it was a very technical course in terms of giving you a grounding on all aspects of filmmaking. And at the end of that, I was probably still most interested in writing and directing. And I did all sort of I graduated in 2004 or 5, I can't remember. And between that and 2007, I did all sorts. Like I got into editing. I edited, for a period, I was working for a couple in Hounslow, editing Sikh and Muslim wedding videos, which was interesting. I tried to get a job in post-production, and the standard route is you go to a post-production house, start as a runner making tea, coffee and toast for people, and then gradually get to learn how the kit is, and then if you're lucky become an assistant editor. And then, but I never actually managed to get a foot in the door. And I remember one time they thought I'd had the day making tea and coffee, running up and down stairs in Soho and working as hard as I could. And at the end of the day, it was a trial day, so they got a 3 days work from me. And they said, "Oh, we think you're really great, but we don't think you're serious." Like, they didn't believe that I was willing just to be a runner because I'd gone to Cambridge. I was like, what? Like, they were penalising me. Anyway, it was a blessing in disguise. And then I managed to get some work experience at Icon Entertainment, which was the film sales and distribution company for Mel Gibson. So Mel he'd basically been burnt directing films for the studios in terms of, and he wanted to keep more of the film's financial success for himself. So he set up, in addition to his production company, which is based in LA, a sales and distribution company in London and a distribution company in Australia, so that when he made films like Apocalypto, he could earn money selling it around the world to other distributors, earn money when it did well in the UK and Australia, and also just earn money as the producer. And alongside that, we tended to service other people's films. And the development department there, which was effectively, producers would come to us with their films, which would be a package, a script, and a director and cast attached, and say, look, will you help us put together the finance? And as part of helping them, we would also offer creative notes to the producer, which they were free to ignore, but normally didn't, because we knew what might work in Japan. You know, if you want a Japanese distributor to promise to pay you a certain amount of money, make these changes. And that's often, in those days, how films were financed, by pre-selling. And it still happens a bit today. You pre-sell the project to a bunch of distributors and then take those promises of payment to a bank, and that's how you get your budget. And then from that, and I started to look at the directors and writers we were working with and realized they were much more talented than I was. I got an interest in just development generally, which is story. And it all came back. I mean, story was what got me into film in the first place, watching films and falling in love with them, and stories where I ended up.
So you sounds like you've had a real journey, a real story
to
get where you are today. Do you have any tips for students, or even for like your younger self, for people who would like to follow in your footsteps? Do you recommend doing the route of Cambridge and film school, or just like trying to take any opportunity that life throws at you?
I think generally, going to Cambridge is always going to help. There's a certain kudos, rightly or wrongly. And sadly, unsurprisingly, depending on your point of view, lots and lots of people, especially in development roles, are humanities graduates from Oxbridge, like most people, and that's just true of the industry as a whole. But it certainly doesn't hurt. It just depends what you want to do. I don't think at a certain point, nobody cares where you went to university, and nobody cares. The industry is all about track records. So as soon as you've got one credit, you're the guy who directed It Follows, or you're the person who wrote Hereditary. That's all that matters. If you want to be a writer or director, it's just getting that first opportunities to challenge. I think if you 100% know you want to be a writer, the best thing you can do is just write and write and write, and ditto with directing. But if, like me, you sort of have you want to do that, but you also have a passion to learn about other aspects of the industry, I think learning a bit about everything and learning what you like and also what you're good at, because the two tend to go hand in hand. You tend to like what you're good at and be good at what you like, is a good thing. And I'm glad, in a way, I did that. So I'm glad I did. I'm glad my parents made me go to university. I don't think film school is by any stretch of the imagination necessary. It did help me. But I can imagine for lots of other people, it wouldn't be the right course of action.
Going back to what you said about being head of development, just to give people more of an insight into that, what does that specifically entail? Maybe like a day in the life of head of development.
Sure. I mean, it depends on what type of organization you're in. I'm in a production company now. So my job is to look for stories to turn into film and television shows, find writers to write those scripts, work with those writers to make those scripts good, find directors to direct them, and then find buyers to pay for them. And then when they're shooting, I mean, now I'm also producing, which means actually being on set every day, overseeing the production. But even if I was exec producing, it would be, either being on set or just watching the rushes as they come in, and giving creative feedback on them. I mean, there's a limit to what you can do once the ball is rolling. And then when we get into the edit, again, it's working on the edit. And they say a film is made 3 times: one at script stage, once when you shoot it, and finally in the edit. And my job is to be involved in all 3 stages in different capacities.
And when you're deciding on those projects, we've seen recently a greater push for more representation and diversity. Is that something that now there's a focus on when you pick up new scripts and new ideas, or throughout the whole process?
We just look. I look for things that interest me. I get bored really easily, and I think part of that is looking for something that we haven't seen before. And a large part of that is obviously going to be, diverse stories, because lots of them haven't been told. So I think that's kind of part and parcel in finding new exciting stories to tell. I think there's 2 separate conversations. One's about employment, and employing diversely, which is a one issue, and the other is just telling diverse stories. And I think they're both important, but they sometimes get conflated, and I think they are two separate issues that the industry faces.
Thank you. Moving on to specific projects. Firstly, about Breathe. How did you become involved, and what was it like to develop the film with Jonathan Cavendish?
I'm going to say I actually didn't do a lot on Breathe, not loads. When I joined the Imaginarium, the script existed. It was a beautiful script written by Bill Nicholson, and although I provided creative feedback on the script and in the edit, it was very much Jonathan working with Andy and Bill. So and it's an amazing true life story. It was interesting because the film it didn't perform fantastically financially, and some people really enjoyed it. I think it's an incredibly moving film, and I think it got released slightly at the wrong time of the year. It got released in awards season when actually it's not necessarily an awards film. It got criticised for not being realistic, and it's like you had Jonathan and Diana, who's still alive, his mother. It was their story. They're like, this happened. It's not like this is how we dealt with it. And maybe that doesn't necessarily make for amazing, as dramatic as it could have been, but it was real. And so it was funny to see that criticism come in when you had the people who lived it going, no, this is what happened. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I watched it and I loved it, and I think it's very beautiful. Going back to what you said about the release, could you explain sort of as head of development, how much thinking needs to go into when you release films in terms of festivals or
a hell of cinema's changing so drastically, so some of this possibly isn't as relevant as it once was, but cinema goers tend to be people with a lot of time on their hands, which means that's sort of teenagers or people who are retired, and that's a trend that's continued for the past almost 10 years. So that's why there's the grey pound, as they call it, or the over 55s market, and you get Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, or more recently things like Finding Your Feet is squarely aimed at them. And then films for young people like the Marvel films, and both demographics, they don't want to spend time at home. They are at home all the time. Once they're like retired and want to get out and make an evening of it and go. My parents go to the cinema more than I do. I've got kids, so by the time I've got a babysitter in and we've gone out for a meal, I'm like 100 quid in the hole, especially with London cinema prices. So there is a small window, however, that's, for whatever reason, the awards window, which is sort of from end of October through to January, where everyone dumps the films they think might win an Oscar. And our distributor, felt that it had awards potential, the film. And obviously it's hard to resist if you've got people saying this is going to win lots of awards. And so it was released in the midst of a very busy awards season, and I think it got lost. Whereas if it had been released sort of March, April, after the Oscars and the BAFTAs were over, which is where all Wes Anderson films tend to get released there, because they don't, for whatever reason, Wes Anderson films don't tend to get either the British Academy or the American Academy that excited, but audiences sort of like him and want to watch his film. It's a place where really high quality but not edgy films tend to do well, and you know, critics watch. I mean, it's insane how many films get made each year and just never see the light of day. We call them festival films. You know, they'll play at a couple of festivals and then disappear off the face of the earth. And critics who watch hundreds and hundreds of films each year, they want something that challenges them. But for the average punter who sees, I don't know, 20 films a year, sometimes they just want a really good, well-made film. They don't want something that is challenging necessarily in that way. And I think for me, Breathe falls into that category of being an exceptionally well-made, moving story. But it's not challenging in the way that, you know, Son of Saul is.
Do you sometimes find yourself then in a battle between choosing something that will critically perform well, that will get a lot of hype for the studio itself, or something that's just for the average punter that just wants to go to the cinema?
I love working in Imaginarium. We just choose stories that we all love, and sometimes that's horror films. You know, we don't think it's going to win an award. We just think it's going to be scary and fun. And sometimes it's a moving, true life story. You know, and sometimes it is something we hope will win awards. But it's always led from, you know, we don't make films necessarily to win awards. We make films to tell stories that we feel passionately about. And then if you win an award, it's like a cherry on top. I mean, the one thing I would say is, you know, no one's sort of out there cynically making a film just to make a bucket load of cash. Filmmaking is incredibly hard. And I think the fact that any film gets made is a minor miracle. And then when a good film gets made, it's a complete miracle. Because they can go wrong in so many different ways.
Yeah. Moving then from Breathe to The Ritual, you worked on development and as an executive producer for The Ritual. What was it about the script or pitch that intrigued you? Is there anything in particular you look for in a script when you pick it up?
So The Ritual was it was the first project I saw from beginning to end. So it began when I read the book, and I fell in love with the book. There was a scene in it, which is in the film, where the four lads, is sort of blokes go walking in the woods, get lost, nasty stuff happens style film. And there's a bit where they get lost in the woods and they come across this old cottage, and it's raining, so they decide to spend the night in it. And then they wake up and they're all in different positions and something weird's happened, and it just stuck with me. I just thought that's going to look fantastic. And that's the point where I thought this will make a great film. And we ended up changing the entire second half of the book is very different to the film. But it was reading that going, okay, this is going to be a good film. This is spooky. It had that quality that I always look for in projects where it's the same but different. Mm-hmm. So if anything's too different, it becomes very difficult to convince people to give you money for it. But if it's too much the same, then it's like, well, it's exactly the same. So you want that thing where it's the same but different. So it's like lots of successful things like the Blair Witch Project, but it was different because it did something, you know, it had a really weird creature in it, spoiler alert, and you know, just went in a different direction and surprised audiences. So we optioned the book, which is where you pay the author a little bit of money to give you the right to, in the future, purchase the film rights. And then we actually attached a director who isn't David Bruckner first, and that director and I both immediately at the top of our list had this young writer called Joe Barton, who had a spec script that we had both read, which is now being made. It's called Invasion. It's now being shot at the moment by Michael Pearce with Riz Ahmed starring. And Joe read the book, liked it, and we started working with him on it. Then we got the script to a certain point. Then we got E1 interested, so they came on board to finance it. Then we lost our director. Then we got David Bruckner on, who was fantastic. And then we cast it and went to Romania to shoot it, which was meant to double for Sweden.
I was going to say, do you have to change your approach to development, whether depending on genre or whether you're adapting a novel? Does it change with the project?
No, you just always got to bear in mind what you liked about it when you first came across it, and make sure that doesn't disappear. And our job is to entertain. I mean, we're not an art house. I mean, I don't think we don't make art house cinema. We're a small organization, but we don't. Those films get made because there are certain filmmakers who have very strong visions, and as producers, you serve their visions, and that's not who we are. We're trying to entertain people, and hopefully make them laugh and cry and scare them, depending on the film. So, and I'm lucky in that I have a pretty eclectic taste. Like my first job when I was sort of 18, before I went to Cambridge, I got a job working in a video store in Nottingham, which I loved. And I used to do a 12-hour shift and watch almost 6 films a day. It was fantastic because nobody comes into a video store. I mean, they don't exist anymore, but nobody used to come into a video store during the day. You'd get the odd person first thing in the morning dropping off cassettes, and then after school finished, you'd get parents with kids. But during the day, like, nobody came in. And my boss used to say, look, company policy is you can watch a U or a PG, but no one will mind if you put on a 12. And I realised, actually, because no one comes in, you can watch whatever you like. So that was my real education, just because I had a library of every film you could ever hope to watch. So I was watching Reservoir Dogs and whatever else 18-rated films there were. I just hoped that when I hit the pause button and a customer came in, it wasn't someone's head exploding. But so when I'm developing projects, really, I'm sort of thinking as an audience member, like what would entertain me. So if it's a horror, it's like, yes, you want to be scared. You buy a ticket for a horror film, it's a bit like a roller coaster ride. You want to be scared. If it's a comedy, you want to laugh. If it's a romance, you want to be moved, and you to that extent, I guess you change your approach, but really, fundamentally, it's the same task.
Speaking of being scared, what was the development like for the monster in The Ritual? And did your character development or story development for Godzilla help?
Again, like the Godzilla thing is a really strange credit. Andy got approached. They'd shot the film, and then they were looking at the early VFX, and I'm so, when the studio films have so many people involved, and the amount of people between me and the people making the decisions on Godzilla is huge. But basically, my understanding is Andy got asked to help with, because Andy's known for performance capture, sort of creating digital characters, to help put some emotion into the digital characters in that film. So there's Godzilla, and then there's these 2 other creatures in that film. And it was just to give them some sense of, intention. So they weren't just pixels. And so Andy workshopped on the characters, and I helped. We sort of talked about character motivations for these huge monsters, which was fun. It didn't really cross over with The Ritual. With The Ritual, there's this amazing concept artist called Keith Thompson, and David Bruckner, who's worked with Keith, brought him on board for the Ritual. And Keith came up with a bunch of sketches, and the one we settled on was certainly not the one I would pick. There was a different sketch which had a creature with a bony skull and looked really creepy, but was probably really derivative. And David was just attached to this weird moose creature, and we sort of ummed and ahed about it. And the one thing that stuck out to me was I didn't know if it was going to be scary, the creature, but I did know that I'd never seen anything like it before. So it was at least original. So I thought, well, let's, rather than choose a derivative design, let's go with this one. And it was, it was one of the most successful aspects of the film.
Sticking with that originality point, were there when you went into the project, were you trying to differentiate it from other horror films? Were you like, oh, I'm going to steal that trick, I'm going to take that suspenseful moment, and how they did that?
Yeah, I mean, I talk. Sometimes it's a shortcut to talk about other films. So you often do go, oh, it's a bit like this moment here. I mean, I was talking today to a writer about their project, and I sort of said, oh, do you remember that bit in Men in Black where this sort of structure happens? In a lot of what development, we can't really tell writers what dialogue to write. Like that's they've either got it or they haven't got it. I mean, you can say that the odd line is either too on the nose or make suggestions, but it's something that it's harder for a development person to fix dialogue, I think, than it is just structure, building blocks. And that's where I think a lot of the analytical skills you pick up in humanities degrees come in useful, because you can analyze why something is or isn't working, and then give suggestions, but you can't actually write it. So, if I work with a bad writer, I'm not going to make it a good script. I have to, only if I work with good writers will it be a good script. But yeah, I mean, people nick stuff all the time.
Going on to a very exciting project that's going to come out soon, the Next Goal Wins. Next Goal Wins, just to keep everyone in the loop, is about a Dutch-American coach who tries to lead an American Samoan team to the FIFA World Cup. How did that story come about? How did you find out about the writer?
So there was a documentary called Next Goal Wins, which I saw, and we fell in love with, and then we optioned it like you would option a book. And then, because we saw the doc and we thought there was a story, like, won't spoil anything for anyone who hasn't seen it, and I would thoroughly recommend it to everyone, even if you don't like football. Like, it's not about the football. There was a moment in it that isn't explored in the doc that I thought, wow, that was an interesting story to tell. So we talked to the documentary filmmakers, and it turned out, it really was an interesting story. And so we had a pitch of an idea together with the doc, and then we started thinking about who would be the best person to write and direct it, and Taika was top of our list, and we sent it to him, and weirdly he had come across the same story about them being the worst team in the world. He hadn't seen the documentary, but had the same idea that it would make a wonderful film, and so he came on board, which was great, and he was just at the start of the point of becoming the hottest director in town, which meant we had to wait, because then he went off and did Thor 3. We waited ages. And then after he shot Thor 3, he was going to do another film, and then thankfully that didn't happen. So then he ended up shooting our film, Christmas 2019.
That's sick. Taika is one of my favorite directors as well. Did you, when you were optioning it, was it a competitive process, or were you the only people?
Competitive. I can't quite remember who the other party was. It was. I mean, it was a competitive process, but I think, part of what we said was that, we would include the filmmakers and make it a much more inclusive process, which is what we like to do when we develop material anyway. Like, if we're optioning a book, we like to include the author in the development process, because why wouldn't you? They've written what you fell in love with, so it makes total sense. That's not always true, and it doesn't always work out. Sometimes authors can't. Film and adaptations have to be different things, and some authors, some creators are good at letting go and being involved in that process while simultaneously letting go, and others aren't.
What was it like, speaking of the process, collaborating with Taika and also Ian Morris, who created The Inbetweeners? Was that just a really fun collaboration, discussing about the script and the tone of the film?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. They're fantastic. To some extent, they're at points in their career where they don't need, they would work very closely together. Taika brought on Ian, who'd worked with in the past, and they would go off and work, deliver a script. We'd get on a call, discuss it. It's different with some, when you've got a director on board, to some extent, especially in film, they've got to lead the process, because at the end of the day, they have to direct it. And that was very much the case in Next Goal Wins.
How, also speaking of their choices as director, did they have obviously they had the main decisions about casting, but did you get to have a say about who played them?
I got told about the casting lists. I didn't know. I had no say, really. I'd be like, well, that's a good idea. But I had zero involvement in that.
Shame.
Well, no, I mean, it's great. You know, so many actors rightly want to work with Taika. I mean, he's an amazing director and he gets great performances, and why wouldn't you? So it was never going to, once he was on board, it was never massively going to be an issue getting good cast, and we got fabulous cast.
Yeah, it's a really, really cool cast. You managed to wrap filming before COVID. When can we expect to see the film released? And also congrats on getting it wrapped before COVID.
It's a good question, and I don't have an answer.
Ooh.
Watch this space.
Moving on to No One Gets Out Alive then, what drew you to adapt another Adam Neville novel?
Oh, it's a very scary book. It's unsurprisingly a horror, given the title. You know, read the book, loved it, super scary. Adam's one of the greatest living horror writers there is. And when it was actually, yeah, we'd finished The Ritual, which had not actually performed in the UK. What happened with The Ritual was the film premiered at Toronto in 2017, and E1 held on to its territories, which I think were the UK and South America, and sold the rest of the world to Netflix. They released the film soon after in the UK, and we got absolutely crushed by Blade Runner 2046, which underperformed in the US but overperformed in the UK. And I think our horror skewed male, where many horrors skew female, and sci-fi also tends to skew male. So a lot of the people who might have gone to see The Ritual instead went to see Blade Runner 2046. So it performed probably about half as much as well as E1 wanted it to perform. But then Netflix released it February 2018, and it was this huge hit. Like, it was everywhere, and millions upon millions of people watched it. And people started making fan art, and it was fantastic. So we actually had in development this project. We'd already optioned it because we like doing horror, and we pitched it. You know, off the back of that success, we then said, "Look, we've got this other one. Do you want to do it?" And they said yes.
And what was the thinking behind the creative decision to change the setting of the novel and move it from Edgware Road to America?
Is it Edgware Road?
Right, that's what I read.
No, it must be Edgware. I'm sure it's set in Birmingham. It was set. I'm pretty sure the novel's set in Birmingham.
UK.
Maybe there's an Edgware Road in Birmingham. The thinking was, it's a haunted house film, and one of the problems with haunted house films is why you don't leave the house. And one of our development assistants had the bright idea of, I mean, you know, one of the issues is you could also go to the police, and then we started thinking, well, what if you couldn't go to the police? And then the thought process was, well, you couldn't go to the police if you were an undocumented worker. And so, and then that made a lot more sense in America, especially at that time. And that's how it came about. So it was really that thought process. It was thinking, you know, creatively, why doesn't this person just leave? Why don't they just go to the police when this happens? And it was about reducing a character's choices, and that's one of the major themes in the film. Is about, you know, when you have nowhere to turn, you know, it's very easy for you to become preyed upon by people.
And definitely a very important and current story to tell. The film is produced in collaboration with Netflix. What's it like working with them this time as sort of a production company instead of a distributor?
On both occasions, fantastic. I think they're incredibly filmmaker friendly. I think it helps that that's what they do. Like, they're all about content. You know, on the distribution of The Ritual, they were brilliant. Included us in every step of the way. Cut a new trailer, which David loved. Produced lots of great artwork, and then for this process, fantastic. Like, they're really, you know, they've got very smart executives there. I mean, to some extent, it's a people. You know, I'm sure it depends on who you get, but our executive team are brilliant. Give great script notes. Have been incredibly supportive because we shot the film. The film started shooting March last year, and we were shooting in Cleveland, Ohio for a day when we got shut down. And then the film, it's set in Cleveland, but we were shooting the interiors in Romania because it's cheap. We could do a big studio build, and it was cheaper to build the house. So do the outside in America and the inside in Romania. And it was Santiago Menghini, the director. It's his first feature. He's just done shorts up until this point. And on the first day of his first feature, I had to tell him we had to stop. And we managed to shoot one more additional day. We shot some additional exteriors, which allowed us to pick up filming back in Romania. We moved the other scenes we were going to shoot in the US to Romania, and then picked up filming again in September, and we wrapped in November.
Wow.
So it was a very disjointed process.
Yeah.
And I spent most of last year abroad, like January, February, March, and then July through to November.
That's so impressive that you managed to wrap during COVID. With Santiago, how did you find him and bring him on if you'd only done short films before? Did you have a particular film that you'd seen and loved?
I had seen his films, but I'd forgotten about them. What happened was quite a funny story. So in the US, there are these big agencies, CAA, WME, ICM, and UTA, and there's lots of other good agencies besides them, but they're the big four. They tend to have an agent that covers each studio. So there'll be an agent that covers Netflix. And as soon as Netflix effectively greenlight a film, often the agency, it's their job to know, and it's their job to try and get the agency's clients on the job. And so they knew we were looking for a director, and so I was sort of taking calls from these fielding agents and fielding calls from these agents that covered Netflix. And we'd made a decision, because it was going to be a relatively sizable budget, that we weren't going to consider first-time directors. And there had been one exception. There'd been a Latino director who didn't, in the end, wasn't available. But as I was speaking to this agent, I said, look, we're not going to, because of the budget, we're not going to look at first-time directors. And then I said, oh, there was one director, but really they'd done a very accomplished short film, and it was a very accomplished short film. And then this director whose agency did not represent Santiago said, oh, was that Santiago Menghini? And I said, no. I said, oh, because we had him on other projects. I thought it might have been him. So immediately after the call finished, I looked up Santiago Menghini, realized I'd seen one of his earlier short films and loved it and been terrified by it, and then contacted his agent and requested his more recent short films, which were even better. And then I was like, well, this guy has to do it. And so that's how it came about. It was the wrong agency giving me a tip about another agency's client.
That's so funny. Is that a large part of being head of development, sort of like watching a few, like not a few, probably tons of short films and picking up on where you think the next best director is going to come from, or where talent's going to come from? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, Santiago's shorts I had come across, which helped. Joe Barton, it was a spec script he hadn't made. I mean, I think he had some TV produced, but it was his first feature. And that was from a spec script that we read and loved. So talent scouting, finding new talent. I mean, not for nothing, I've worked with Joe now a couple more times, and David. Once you find new talent, you develop relationships with them. If you like them, and then you like working with them, and you want to work with them again, and that's how it works. It's harder for me to pick up the phone to Martin Scorsese and say, do you want to do this film? And not least because he doesn't need us, he can make his own films. So a large part of it is about finding new talent.
Speaking of Joe Barton and his writing, you're currently producing a new TV series called Half Bad for Netflix, which he has written. How did this project come about?
I read the book. It was back in 2013. We read a lot of unpublished manuscripts, so we tend to become aware of books sometimes when there's been a publishing deal, although sometimes even when there hasn't been a publishing deal. In this case, it had been the Book of Bologna Book Fair, which is a big children's book fair where lots of rights get sold, and it took the Guinness Book of World Record for selling into more languages than any other book in history pre-publication. And we loved it. We tried to go after it, and then Fox 2000, which doesn't exist anymore, paid silly money for it. and so we missed out on it. But then what I used to do, when you option material, you tend to option it for 18 months. And so I put a note in my diary for 18 months time, just in case Fox optioned it and then did nothing with it, which is exactly what happened. So 18 months later, I sent an email to the agent and said, look, I'm sure Fox are doing something with it, but in case they're not, we are still interested. And they said, well, actually, the executive who optioned it left Fox and no one has picked up the baton and they're going to let the option lapse. And so as soon as it lapsed, we optioned it. And then I sent it to Joe. Joe read it, liked it, and we worked on it ever since.
And how does development for TV differ from film? Do you have to sort of almost like extend the story into episodes, obviously, but like, does that change your process?
Yes, but sometimes you have to do that for film anyway. I mean, it's not, sometimes if you're developing a true life story, you don't have enough you don't necessarily have enough material for that particular bit of the story, and so you have to invent it or anything. So it is. I guess it is a bit different. I don't necessarily approach it differently, but then I'm sure people who work exclusively in TV might do things differently to me. I'm sure every development executive works differently. I mean, fundamentally, we're all just trying to make the scripts as good as they can be. But I don't, people probably, I've never worked, I've only worked with the writers myself, so I don't know how other people work.
You're set to film Half Bad this summer. What are you allowed to tell us so far about locations or the set of the shoot?
Well, I mean, it broadly follows the story of the book, which is, I thoroughly recommend. It's a great book. And beyond that, I can't really say much.
Damn it. Another question, which I actually find really intriguing, is how do you prepare for a covered shoot? Do you find it sometimes is like creatively enhancing because you can sort of be really flexible with your ideas, or is it just really a nightmare?
Well, I hope, having spent 4 months in Romania under COVID conditions shooting No One Gets Out Live, I hope this shoot is not a COVID shoot in the same way. I mean, Netflix were incredibly supportive because your budget goes up drastically. You've got to buy a ton of PPE. We were testing cast and crew 3 times a week. It affects catering. It affects, weirdly, you need more crew, not less, we found, because you need, people to be socially distant. So you can't all cram in, or like, we had to have separate teams. So we had an A camera and a B camera, but we therefore had to double up on grips because we didn't want one set of grips going between the camera units.
Yeah.
So we had to get 2 sets of grips. So it actually increased crew, not decreased crew. As they say, most people reckon it increases your budget by 25%, and Netflix were incredibly supportive in helping us with those costs. But still, it's just tiring. You're wearing these N95 face masks all day. We were lucky because we were based at Bufta Studios, and we were pretty much the only production filming there for the entire run. So we had this huge space, and for at least part of it, it was summer, autumn before we really hit the coldest, wettest weather. And so it was easy for us to just be outside and take breaks, have spaces where you could take your mask off. But it was challenging, and by the end, people, understandably, especially foreign crew, were ready to go home. Not least me. I mean, my boy wasn't walking or talking when I left. I came back and he was doing both.
Oh
no. Well, at least you're in lockdown with him now. Speaking of Corona, what do you think the future of film will hold post-Corona? Fingers crossed we will get there.
I mean, I think it's accelerated a shift that was already happening. I touched on it before, but despite working in film, it's very difficult for me to go to the cinema. But I will, I have all the streaming services pretty much, and I will pay a premium to watch a new release. And the cinemas, understandably, have resisted that day and date releasing. I first did it for the weekend, 45 years. 45 years. The Peter, I forgot what the director's called. Charlotte Rampling and someone else. Anyway, I'm happy to pay 10 quid for me and my wife to watch a new release, but cinemas have not wanted to do that. And you've seen what Warner Brothers have done with their entire, I mean, an amazing move on their part. I'm not sure it's the right move or the wrong move, but to release their entire slate on HBO Max, it's obviously upset a lot of filmmakers, not least because of the financial impact it will have. Because the only way to make, significant sums is, there's no better way of making significant sums of money than a blockbuster.
Mm.
The streaming deals are good, but they're not the same as being, Avengers Endgame and breaking in billions upon billions of dollars. And I'm sure one complicated situation is that they weren't the sole financier on some of those projects. So like June and the King Kong films, you've got Legendary in the mix, who were the major financier of those things. So it's a very interesting situation. But I do think, some people, like teenagers, will still want to go to the cinema because they don't want to be, it's where they meet their friends, and they will still buy tickets. Whereas I will watch the film at home because I wasn't going to the cinema anyway. So I don't. It's one of those things where I think there will still be a place for cinema. I think it will be for either huge tentpole films, or there'll be art house cinemas. There'll be your picture houses and your Curzons, which will probably cater slightly more for cinephiles and the over 55s market, and your showcases and your views will cater for teenagers.
We shall see what happens.
And by the way, the worlds are continuing to, the division between film and TV continuously disappears. I mean, if you look at something like Queen's Gambit, these high-profile, big-budget minis are becoming very popular, and that's sort of where the studios stopped making really smart dramas a while ago. Look at those kind of $20 million dramas that would have serious actors, high production values. They're the undoing. They're sharp objects. They would have, in days gone by, have been films, and now, they're these mini series.
Definitely. Speaking of the future, do you have any projects in the pipeline that you can tell us about, or anything that you have optioned that you're waiting for?
Nothing that I can tell you about. We've optioned a book that I'm very excited about, but it's not getting announced till March.
Okay,
I think it's a big book.
Have to wait and see.
Sorry.
Keeping your cards close to your chest. So soon we'll have some questions from our audience. Please type your questions into the Q&A box and we will read them out. While we are waiting, we will ask our final question. Do you have any TV or film recommendations to fill our lockdown terms? And also, because you spent so long in that film and video store, are there any old classics that you watched whilst you were there that you were like, oh my God, this is the best film ever. Why has no one watched it?
Okay, recent things I've watched that I've loved. We binged It's a Sin, which is phenomenally good. Like, that is a screenwriter at the height of their powers. The first episode, the script for that is worth studying. It's just, to make you care about those characters as quickly as he does is it's just phenomenal. So that on the TV side, I'm enjoying The Great. I'm trying to think what else that we really loved. A Queen's Gambit I really enjoyed. There's a chess project I've always wanted to do. Not that the TV show's it's about chess, but it's also not about chess. But I enjoyed it when it came along because it reignited that conversation internally. It's like, chess can work on screen. It's like sports movies. People are always scared of doing sports movies because it puts off, people think it puts off half your audience. So a film about football, we had those very discussions with Next Goal Wins. And it's not really about football at all. It just happens, that they're playing football. Classics. I made my wife watch Casablanca before we watched Mank, and I'm amazed how well that holds up and how modern that feels still. And if you haven't seen it, you should definitely see it.
I watched Casablanca last week for the first time because everyone was like, oh, it's a really good film. And I just watched Gone with the Wind and I was like, oh, that did not age well. Watched Casablanca and was like, this is such a good film.
Yeah. I had this weird, for ages, I sort of binged a lot of classic cinema when I was about 16, 17. And I was always struck, I'd always written off in my head for some reason that old films had simpler stories and were not as, or because because of the censors, were not able to tell such touch upon such edgy topics as modern storytellers can. But it's totally wrong. I mean, it's just the subject matter dealt with in many classic films is rich and nuanced and still topical as anything being produced today. So I definitely, the BBC iPlayer's got a ton of great classic films on at the moment, including Casablanca, that's worth checking out. I don't know. With kids, I mean, I tend to watch films in binges, like when I go to a festival like Cannes or Berlin. And at the moment, by the time we put the kids to bed, we watch one episode of TV and then we go to sleep, and then we're up at 5. So I'm not up to date on all the fantastic things that I really enjoyed Saint Maud. Saint Maud's a fantastic horror film, brilliantly edited by Marc Towns, who we're working with at the moment on No One Gets Out Alive, and I would thoroughly recommend that. And it's one of the best British films I've seen this year. Yeah.
Well, that was a very comprehensive list, so thank you very much. Our first question is, for an aspiring screenwriter, what is it about writers or their work which makes them stand out?
I would say for an aspiring screenwriter, I'll give 2 different answers. One, in terms of standing out, is about how you get noticed. Because if you want to be a writer, you need to get an agent. And so the first challenge for any writer is getting an agent. And my advice is always to write as much as you can. I would concentrate on either feature scripts or pilot scripts, like short film scripts. People care about short films for the director, not really the writer. So if you want a body of work that is going to get you noticed, it needs to either be a feature script or a pilot script. And enter them into online competitions. There are tons, and sometimes you have to pay, but they're just a useful barometer, because if you enter a script into 5 competitions and it doesn't make the quarterfinals of any of them, it's probably because it's not very good, and you just have to be honest. And there's no point. You should always get a script to a stage that you're happy with, but not get to draft 13. Just go through it, make it as good as it can be, and then send it out into the world and see what happens. Because there's no you'll never have a shortage of good ideas. Is my opinion. I think you'll always come up with another idea. The difference between a good writer and a bad writer is not necessarily the idea itself, it's the way they tell the story. Like a really good writer could take a very normal journey and make it as fascinating as the Titanic sinking. And that just comes from, I think that's just knowing your craft. I mean, I talked about It's a Sin with Russell T Davies. It's worth, I think I don't know if they have the script, if it's available, but it's worth tracking it down just to see how he does it. It's amazingly efficient. And then when you enter those competitions, hopefully over time you start winning some of them. And then when you send an email to an agent, instead of it just saying, "Dear sir or madam, please read my script. I'd love to be represented by you," your email says, "Dear sir or madam, please read my script. It won this competition and this competition. I'd love to be represented by you." And I know which one I'd read first. Like if I've got 100 scripts to read, I'm going to read the one where I know other people have read it and said it's good. I'll read that one first. And that's sort of when we're looking for, we do the same thing when we're looking for books to option. Because they haven't come out yet, no one's reviewed them. We look for indicators that tell us whether people think it's any good. And the best indicator is whether someone's paid money for it. So we tend to look for, and if they've paid big money, they probably back it a lot. If the book's got into an auction, if 5 publishers want a manuscript, it's probably a good book. So we tend to read those ones first than ones that are just from an agent saying, "Hey, there's this new book, you should read it." No, we'll read the one that was auctioned off. So, I would enter online competitions, and that'll help you get noticed and help you get an agent. And then in terms of your work standing out, I would say entertain. Like your job is to entertain the reader, and ask yourself, what is this scene doing to entertain? I mean, they say drama is conflict, and yeah, of course it is, but films don't have to be dramatic in every scene. They can be scary. So is this scene scary? Does it make you laugh? I think as long as you entertain someone, there doesn't have to be necessarily any conflict in a film for it to work. It can just be, entertaining. The cardinal sin of any writer is to be boring.
Thank you.
Moving on to another anonymous question. Did you realise a role like the one you have now existed when you were at uni? Do you think you would have been interested in it then?
I don't think I did. No, I'm not sure I didn't know it existed. When I started running, I did some running at various production companies, including company pictures, and then I think I got a better idea of what it meant to be in development. Like that was the department that dealt with scripts and creative stuff, and because it does deal with creative stuff, you know, it's the fun department, which means it's massively oversubscribed and probably underpaid compared to other, you know, other departments. But no, you know, it wasn't until I was doing work experience within production companies that I really understood the different departments: production department, you know, legal and finance and business affairs, and you know, when I was at Icon, there was marketing and publicity. There was home entertainment and theatrical that had the different marketing departments because, you know, the strategies were different. And they're all interesting in their own right. But I just, what doing all these jobs made me learn is that I loved story and I wanted to work on story. This is what I do now.
Speaking of stories, do you prefer to adapt stories from real life or books, or make original stories?
I mean, both. We don't tend to develop as much original ideas for film. It's, you know, film development is probably riskier than TV development. We will with writers, we'll develop original ideas in TV a lot more than we will with film. I mean, I never say never, and we have done it, but I think with film we always like to know what the beginning, middle, and end of a story is before we begin. Whereas with TV, to some extent, it can be open-ended. You know, there might be a subsequent series, or you know, you've got time to answer those questions in a way you don't. You know, you need to know that a film has an ending because after 90 minutes, you know, the lights come on. So the only time we've done originals is probably in horror, because it's a clearer genre than it is to do anything else. We tend to like there being some underlying material. It can just be, you know, someone's story, like in Breathe. There was no book or documentary. It was just someone's story. More generally, we option books.
This is a practical question from a student. What valuable experience do you get whilst at uni that has helped you further yourself in your career? What would you recommend they get involved in?
Well, I didn't do it. I mean, during term time, I barely did anything other than watch films. I mean, watch lots of films and TV and read lots of books is always good. Then in my because you get long holidays at Cambridge, I used to try and do as much as I could in the holidays. So either that was doing a short course at the London Film Academy, or working on other people's films, or just getting work experience. You know, these are all things you could do in your summer holidays, and that was very useful. Because I'm sure many of you will want to be writers and directors, but you know, there's a ton of other really interesting careers out there, and you know, they're all very hard still to get into. But it's just finding, you know, I guess I ended up finding what I was doing, what I was good at, and not what I thought I wanted to do.
Speaking of the development role, another student has asked, do you know if this role exists in TV and theatre as well as film?
I don't know about theatre, but definitely in TV. And you know, increasingly, because of the way it's going, more and more film companies are doing television. You know, we used to do primarily film, and now our TV slate is twice the size of our film slate.
Oh, wow.
And some companies have different departments. They'll have a film department and a TV department. Everyone works across both.
And then a final question from us before we have to end, sadly. Do you have a dream project that you'd love to work on that you're sort of hoping one day down the line you'll manage to develop?
I would have loved to have worked on Dune. It was my favorite book as a kid, and that would definitely be up there. I think, you know, the reality of making. I mean, I grew up watching things like Star Wars and Indiana Jones and all those big franchises and Ghostbusters. I think working on those projects for someone like me would not be as rewarding. You know, it'd be part of me thinks it would be great fun, but you're working for a machine that does things in a certain way. You don't have the freedom to do it. So I'd much rather find something like, you know, the next Harry Potter and work on, because I love world creation, and work on a franchise like that. And actually, thankfully, we have a project which I'm very excited about, which I hope will be something like that. And that it's just being able to, you know, the power of cinema is to present people different worlds and that's something that got me into film, and it's something I'd like to try and you know, I know I enjoy working on, would like to try and recreate for other people. So we would like to do more big budget stuff. You know, we've done, I mean, Imaginarium has worked on, you know, we did Mowgli for Warner Brothers, and Andy's just done Venom 2 for Sony. So we do work on big studio films, but always we're normally not as in charge as we could be. Often those films come with a lot of producers already attached. Whereas if you take a project like that to the studios and get them to finance it, you can sort of control it a lot more. I'd love to be able to do some of those big, you know, do the next Indiana Jones or the next, you know, rather than do Star Wars 17, do something that is the next big sci-fi soap opera.
Very exciting words to end on. I think that's all we have time for, but thank you so much, Will, for your answers.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
The time, and thank you to everyone who joined the call and asked amazing questions. Thank you again.
Please like our Facebook page for more updates and opportunities. Our guest next week is former Globe casting director Karishma Balani at 5:30 p.m. on the 3rd of February. Register for the Q&A on our Facebook event, or the link is in our Instagram bio.
Thank you so much, Will, and have a good rest of your evening.
You too. Thanks.